Namaskar and welcome to the special program, COVID and the Global Economy. In this episode, we're going to look at the impact of COVID on the global economy, the disruptions it caused both on the demand side as well as the supply side, and see how the economy has adjusted to these disruptions. We have done two separate one-on-one interviews with two eminent guests. Let me introduce you to them. Dr. Joydeep Prabhu is Jawaharlal Nehru Professor of Indian Business and Enterprise and the Director of the Centre for India and Global Business at Judge Business School, Cambridge University, UK. He has a BTech from IIT Delhi and a PhD from the University of Southern California. His special interests are international business, marketing strategy, and innovation. He has authored and co-authored several papers and books, including Jugaad Innovation, Think Frugal, Be Flexible, Generate Breakthrough Growth. And Dr. Jayamani Bhagwati is an economist and former ambassador of India to the UK and EU. In his long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service, he served on deputation to the World Bank for 13 years, heading the corporate finance division of the World Bank. He has served in several capacities, both in the Ministry of External Affairs and in the Ministry of Finance, and has vast experience in global economic relations. Post his retirement from service, he served as the RBI Chair Professor at ICRIA for 5 years and is currently the Chairman of IDFC Asset Management Trustee Company. He did his MS in Finance from Sloan School, MIT, and his PhD from Tufts University, United States. So let's begin. The question that comes to mind is the global economy, by most accounts, is in recession. So what is the medium to long-term impact, would you say, of COVID?
So obviously the current situation isn't very good. As you said, recession around the world, the global economy and local economies are all suffering. Now the question is, when will there be a recovery and what will it look like? That's the big question. And the two sort of proposed scenarios are, one is a V-shaped response. So there's a very dramatic decline and then we have an abrupt return to normalcy. And the other is more U-shaped, where it'll take a longer time to recover. And everything really depends on how this whole virus pandemic plays out, particularly whether we get a vaccine soon enough.
It is a grim situation, and we don't know whether there'll be a second wave or a third wave. We don't know when the vaccine is coming. Maybe it will take a year. ICMR's August 15, people don't have much faith in that. But my sense is that going forward, if you go by IMF numbers, forget about my numbers, I have my own thoughts, but let's look at IMF numbers. IMF is projecting for the world about minus 5% but they look at it in terms of calendar year. So they're looking at it as 2020. For us in fiscal 2021, I anticipate, based on my own reckoning and looking at various indicators, about minus 5%. Then it is supposed to jump up because of the low base effect. It could go up to as much as 6-7% for India in 21-22. And it could go up to somewhat positive for the world. But there are so many imponderables here. I think everybody is groping around in the dark.
Indeed, but from reports that I've been reading, even some of the IMF predictions were that the advanced economies are expected to be hit more in terms of a recession than the emerging economies. Would you agree with that? And if so, what does that mean? Then do the advanced economies have to put in much more stimulus than the emerging economies?
So, the engine of growth around the world for the last few years has been emerging economies. So emerging economies, particularly the big ones like China and India, have been driving global growth. And they've been registering, upwards of 5% of growth, whereas the developed economies have been around 1 to 2%, maybe 3% in the case of the US. So now with this massive recession, obviously the numbers go down across the board, and emerging markets, one would imagine, would suffer a little less in the sense that they will not grow as much. There might be a recession, but not as big as in the developed world. But of course, the developed world, as you pointed out, has resources, right? So they can throw money at this, and they have better institutions. So they have perhaps better functioning central banks and so on. They have social security systems. They have more perhaps technologically savvy, so they can use their resources perhaps to mitigate some of the more sort of negative consequences of the pandemic. So maybe they're somewhat more resilient, one might say. But of course, the structural opportunities for growth are higher in emerging markets because they're growing from a lower base.
See, the emerging economies, there are many ranges. When you look at East Asia, is it really emerging? When you think of Malaysia or Singapore, I see them post-emerging. But if you look at African economies or look at Latin America, they're very different. So this is a very wide range. I would say that the developed economies, by and large, because of their high per capita incomes, almost by definition, for them, 3% growth is a very high rate of growth. For us, 7% is like a trend level, which would absorb the large numbers of young people who come into the workforce every year. So you should compare 3% in the developed world, defined broadly as OECD countries, with 7% for India, because you're starting from a low base.
Yes.
Having said that, I think the developed countries are also in trouble. They are not going to come out of it so easily because they have also older populations, except for the US. US doesn't have, like Italy or Germany and some of these countries, or Japan for that matter, so many people with gray hair like me. But India is relatively young like you. So, so you are the hope for the future of India. But joking apart, looking at it more seriously, my sense is that the emerging economies are less exposed, depending on which emerging, in terms of their trade. Now, the problem here is for those countries which trade a lot, given that the developed countries are net buyers of both goods and services. If you look at the US, I use US as a bellwether, kind of they have a large current account deficit year after year. Where do they buy from? They buy from China, they buy from India, they buy from a number of countries, depending on who has what comparative advantage. To that extent, the developing world and the emerging world has the ability to come out of this faster, both because they may have, at least some of them have younger populations, and also because they are less exposed to this business of buying from the rest of the world. So to that extent, yes, you are right.
In terms of priority, which is the issue that needs to be addressed first? Because, where I'm coming from is that job losses would lead to greater contraction of demand, shrinkage of per capita income. So how does one keep the demand side alive then at the end of the day?
Well, I guess, there's the economic question which you're raising, but first is the health question. And there's the question of people's safety and security and so on. So that has to be addressed first. And of course, the immediate way to do that was lockdown, but you can't keep these economies in lockdown for too long. So, this is where now health systems have to be resilient, tracing, tracking, those kinds of systems, testing systems, all that has to be done. So, that's a priority. But I think you're raising a very important point. What about the economic side? We can't ignore that. So what can be done side by side? So, there are both supply and demand issues, but I think you're raising the demand side issue. Many people have lost jobs. They don't have a source of income. If they're in economies which don't have a real social security system, then the spending goes down, demand goes down, and that, of course, puts a massive damper on any economy. So the obvious thing to do there is to have some kind of stimulus on the demand side. If people are losing jobs, you can try and preserve them. Like, for instance, in the UK, you have this furlough system where companies are given some kind of support in order not to let go of their employees entirely, but to support them with some kind of income. So you can have a furlough system like that. You can have some kind of social security. But then in some cases, you might just have to think about a cash transfer, so some equivalent. So in the UK, again, we're thinking of a voucher system where every family in the UK will get something like £500 of vouchers, which they can use to spend on certain companies which are listed.
Yes.
In the US, we had a big stimulus in India too. So I think that's probably the big thing, some kind of conditional or unconditional cash transfer to stimulate demand.
Well, a moment back, you referred to fiscal or any other kind of stimulus and
Yes.
spending that the government or the private sector can do. This particular pandemic has illustrated for those who felt that government is passé, you don't need government. Private sector will take care of everything. This is just shown, again, very dramatically. I mean, for someone like me, I was always aware. That's why I joined government. Government is important in all countries. So government has to take the lead when the private sector is hurting very badly. And the demand boost has to come from government. Right now, the average consumer is short of cash. And whatever little or more, depending on which income bracket you belong to, those who are higher may have a little, but everybody is being very cautious. They're saying, as it is, we have these problems. What if 2 family members fall ill? And even for upper middle class, if you have 2 family members in a hospital, and I'm told private hospitals can charge a lot, and it's very difficult to get admission to government hospitals. Even there, they have to charge at least the cost. So, the only, well, not the only, but the major part of demand expansion has to come through government spending. So countries like the US, or for that matter, Europe, have, and the UK and Japan have moved in with huge increase in government spending. I won't worry so much about credit rating agencies. Right now, I would worry about putting cash into people's hands. And very frankly, to move a little beyond your question is, I am firmly now, earlier I was not, a believer in universal basic income. Give a universal basic income and let's figure out where are the loopholes where those who don't deserve it are getting it, and let's keep cutting down those loopholes. It is like how people objected to Aadhaar. They would object on grounds of confidentiality. This, that. When you look at JAM, Aadhaar is a very integral part of so much that we do today.
Now, when we look at food prices, they haven't been too heavily impacted despite supply chain disruptions. How would you view this? Because this has been a pretty good global response. I mean, there have been some reports where people are, there's a shortage of food. But by and large, despite such lengthy lockdowns, it's not led to serious food shortages and the associated concerns with health. What would you say?
So that has been, I think, there have been some very interesting things that we have learned as a consequence of this massive shock. And one is that so far, at least, the food supply chain and food security has proven resilient. Again, speaking of Europe now, because that's where I live, and Britain being an island and relying quite a bit on the continent for food, it's remarkable how resilient the food security of Britain has been. We haven't seen, as you pointed out, massive rises in price, any kind of inflation for that matter. And I think this is more or less a global story. However, there are some hidden challenges. So for instance, with schools being shut down and lots of kids, particularly lower income kids, kids in poverty, which you have around the world, including in the developed world, those kids haven't been getting access to their school meals and so forth. So there are some of those kinds of issues which are linked to the economic issues and unemployment and things like that that you were talking about.
I think by and large, most countries have some amount of food available. If you look at US, you look at Europe, they have a common agricultural policy. There are countries which are surplus as far as agriculture is concerned. The others consume. Germany imports, I'm sure, a lot of agricultural products from France, which is there at the forefront as far as agriculture is concerned. The Danish, the Holland, etc., export milk and related products and so on. As far as India is concerned, India is more or less self-sufficient in food. Yes, we import some oils from Malaysia, etc. But push comes to shove, India is by and large self-sufficient, and in fact, we have huge stocks of food grains. So I don't see food as a major problem. I see more a problem in terms of there being enough food, but not enough purchasing power. So people are in trouble in rural areas now, particularly those who went back from urban areas because they really don't have work and they don't have purchasing power. How do you
Yes.
get money to the hands of people is more an issue rather than how do you get products. Because as you must have seen, after the lockdown was partially lifted in various parts of the country, of course, Guwahati is at a complete lockdown right now. That's my home state, Assam. But some other parts are not. I think products are getting from one part of the country to another. And in fact, agriculture is doing relatively well. Tractor sales are up, tire sales are up. So that shows that there is purchasing power for certain groups of people who are producing agricultural commodities and goods.
This pandemic has two important responses. You were talking earlier about the health issues which come first and then the economic issues. But it's also about balancing the two. Now, the focus now is largely on reviving the economies of the world. Despite the virus growing, I mean, it continues to increase in numbers, and we're hoping for a cure as well. But is there any other option, would you say, at this time? I mean, could you give any other ideas?
I mean, I think the big one at the moment is, testing and tracing people. That, I think that is the best chance we have. If you look at around the world, if you look at some of the economies that seem to have done the best, the countries that have done the best in responding to this, look at South Korea or Taiwan, Singapore, to some extent, New Zealand, Germany. These are countries that have very early on put into place a pretty well-functioning, robust system of testing and tracking people and making data available. I think that is the best way to do it. Sometimes you can use technology to help with that. I think so, for instance, Karnataka State in Bangalore, I think there's an app that has been used to do that. But it's interesting that even in some very advanced countries and economies such as the US, if you take the state of Massachusetts, they decided to use a testing and tracing system that was not technology dependent because of issues around privacy, and technology always has problems, but simply throwing people at it. And interestingly, they were inspired in their model by what was done in East Africa in response to Ebola, where they would train people to actually go out into the community and actually literally knock on doors and go door to door to find out who had been affected by it. So I think that's the biggest hope for us, is until we get a vaccine, until we find drugs that work reliably, I think kind of testing and tracing, a very rigorous kind of system is our best chance to beat.
No, I think that's about right. I mean, you need to contain the impact of this virus, which means that you need to help people be more aware how to avoid the virus. Those who have already got it, how do you get them treatment? Those who have recovered, how do they reintegrate with the workforce, depending upon their age, of course, if they are still in the workforce. So these are the three kinds of people in the country: those who have not got it, and how do you prevent them from getting it, and those who have recovered. And my sense is that there is very little that, while everything depends on the government, a lot of it depends upon the individual. It sounds like throwing the burden away from government. You and I are talking.
We're talking more, sir, about, globally, because globally too, all economies are opening up now, even though the number of cases are increasing. So, I mean, this is not a situation that's only, prevalent in India.
Even globally, you see different reactions. Look at Brazil and the US. Internationally as well, I think people have to take care that if you like the UK has opened pubs. Now, hopefully people, when they have the second drink, are not slapping others on the back and embracing them and so on and so forth. Yes. So governments can do up to a point, because they have decided to reopen pubs, because there's an important economic activity in the UK. A lot of people depend for their livelihood directly as owners of the pub, but all the kind of, ancillary services which are provided. Now, but the individual cannot escape his or her responsibility, is what I was coming to globally. And of course, obviously applicable to India too.
Well, consumer confidence has been hit pretty badly and will only return, as we know, once the vaccine is found. But pharmaceutical companies are very much in focus, especially those which are working on a vaccine. Uh, Others, what will they do? I mean, other sectors, would they be able to adapt to what's being called a new normal? That's the question.
So again, an interesting consequence of the shock has been that some sectors have obviously thrived, and healthcare sector in particular is a good example because, of course, they are right at the heart of this, and governments are spending, and people, if they have to spend, or insurance companies spend. So clearly, the healthcare sector has benefited. Life sciences will benefit hugely. Pharmaceuticals will benefit, but also any kind of digital online business will thrive and has thrived, particularly retail. So if you think about food, we were talking about food earlier. Those retailers that are online have had a field day. Amazon has done very well. All the sort of social media online companies have done very well, like Facebook, Amazon we talked about. Zoom has done very well, companies like that. So any sort of software or any company that facilitates working from home and distance learning, those kinds of education. Now it's the classic industries that make up the backbone of any economy, the sort of capital intensive logistics industries where people are involved and where contact is crucial. Of course, entertainment, theater, the arts, things like that are very badly affected by this. And it's not clear when there'll be relief, because as you pointed out, consumers, customers want to be assured of safety, and it's not clear when we will be able to ensure that. So it's, some sectors have done brilliantly, other sectors we don't really know how they'll be able to recover.
You see, this world is not going to be the same. That everybody says after every crisis, every war, so I'm going to repeat this cliche. But I think in this case, it is very, very, so perhaps more true than in the past. Why do I say that? Which are the three main segments of any economy? It's industry, it is services, and it's agriculture. Now, if you look at industry, which is car manufacturing, whatever it is, people are going to look to see how can they reduce their dependence on human beings being in close touch with each other. As you and I know, that's what human beings want, socially and otherwise. You want to be close to other people, otherwise you feel like a robot and you feel as if you're cut off from people. But in the workplace, I think there is, so to that extent, while in industry, these engineers, scientists, everybody else will be looking for ways in the future to make industry less susceptible, less at risk to this kind of a pandemic once again. To what extent they are successful, we'll wait and see. You've, of course, heard about robots, the Japanese factories, they have just a few people. The entire car manufacturing plant is serviced by robots. To that extent, they can produce cars, but who's going to buy them? I mean, they can keep producing the cars, but somebody has to buy them. Now come to services. Now services, and I'll come finally to agriculture. Services, unfortunately, when it comes to tourism, when it comes to hotels, when it comes to restaurants, people do come closely in touch with each other. To that extent, those areas, I don't quite know how they will evolve and how will they deal with this kind of a problem, how will they adapt. I think more and more of it, you are supposed to do things on your own. Now, how will it adapt? I don't know. Maybe you'll have more individual tourism, just husbands and wives traveling, not so much in groups. I hope not, because that's always lower cost when you go as a group. Now, coming to agriculture, agriculture is a little easier because as we mechanize, we are on a tractor. There are not 15 people in a group unless they are singing a bhajan or something together, in which case, hopefully they will figure out how to do it in the future when a similar situation arises.
The final question in this segment is, when do you see the global economy turning around?
Well, that's, I think it's at this point, lots of people are trying to guess when that's going to happen. And the reason why it's so hard to predict is because it turns entirely on this question of a vaccine.
Yes.
And we know that there are many contenders, including from India. The leading contender at the moment is a vaccine from Oxford. Um, uh, but vaccines are very hard to develop reliably. They have to be tested, of course, and that takes time. And they're very tricky things to really get to work. I mean, we still don't have a reliable vaccine for things like Ebola and so on, and those are quite old, versions of these kinds of pandemics. So I think everything turns on when we have a vaccine. If we have a vaccine by early to mid 2021, which is when people expect that's the best case scenario, then and if we are able to manufacture that at scale and distribute it, then we could have a very quick turnaround in 2021. But if that vaccine doesn't come through or doesn't work as well, then we are looking at a longer, more protracted kind of period of shock.
I think the only way it will go back to pre-COVID is if we have a vaccine. And because then people will feel confident. I've taken the vaccine. I can go and shake hands. I can embrace someone because the other chap has also taken a vaccine. And after 4 days, 5 days, I don't know how long you have to be careful after you've taken a vaccine. You don't have fever. You're fine. It's like TB. People take the BCG vaccine when they are kids. And you're not, because TB can be highly contagious, but people are not scared because it's been contained. I know that in lower income groups, there is still TB, but by and large, even in India, we have contained TB. And although it's very, very contagious. So I don't see the global, and I see, since I'm not a person who is in the thick of trying to figure out when and how the vaccine will come, I'm going by media reports. They're saying at least a year. So we're talking about July after the clinical trials, et cetera, are done. So we are talking about the economies of all countries gradually chugging back, depending upon how well their public health systems are working, to be able to get the vaccine to everyone by the middle of calendar year 2021.
And that concludes our first episode, COVID and the Global Economy. I'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Joydeep Prabhu and Dr. Jaimini Bhagwati. And thank you very much for watching. Namaskar.